Endocrine system. This is not just about those hormones that drive us crazy. It's also about target cells and receptors and partnerships where two or more hormones work together. Opposing interaction is one type of partnership where one hormone opposes the effect of another. Great example is insulin. It's released from the pancreas. It reduces glucose concentration in the blood, and it does this by stimulating the red blood cells to absorb glucose from the plasma. Okay, this is a familiar story for most people. Sugar in the plasma needs to be delivered, but it only moves into the red blood cells if insulin, the key, opens the door, and now glucose can slide in. Glucagon is a hormone that opposes insulin. It does this by breaking down glycogen. I know we have two G words here. Glycogen is a compressed form of sugar. We store it in our muscles, we store it in our liver, and it stays there until we need it. And then suddenly, let's say our blood sugar starts to drop. Our body says, whoa, we got to kick that blood sugar back up. And instead of reaching for that energy drink, we have our own energy drink when glycogen is broken apart, and now our glucose concentration in the plasma is stabilized again. Take a look at this diagram. It seems confusing, but if you study it, you'll find it makes complete sense. A synergistic partnership interaction is when you have combined action of two or more hormones, and they're going to trigger an effect on target cells. We find this in female lactation. Ovaries release estrogen, and this hormone affects the number and size of the alveoli, which are glands and ducts in the breast. The breast is packed with glands and ducts that are going to store milk. The pituitary gland, which is at the base of the brain, releases prolactin. This is a hormone that's going to stimulate milk production. So there's a PP, pituitary prolactin. The hypothalamus is needed because, okay, we produce the milk, it goes into the villi, but now we need to release it. So the releasing chemical is called oxytocin, and it causes the milk to squeeze out of the villi and out of the female's breasts. Here it is in summary. Ovaries, estrogen, alveoli, pituitary prolactin, milk, and finally hypothalamus. Usually there's a triggering event for the hypothalamus to release oxytocin. It could be the baby suckling or the baby crying, or maybe she feeds the baby at a certain time of day, and that's a stimulus. So the oxytocin production is not steady. It's in response to some sort of stimuli. Permissive is an interaction you might believe would be when one hormone triggers a target cell only when a different hormone has primed the target first. So you see how it's permissive? It can't happen unless the other one's been there first. One example is estrogen, released from the ovaries. It prepares the endometrium, which is the lining in the uterus. Now, the progesterone hormone triggers the target cells that cause the endometrium to thicken. But without estrogen there first, the uterus will not thicken, and then there's nowhere for the implantation of the fertilized egg. So this all involves fertilization and production of the baby. Types of hormones, there are so many. I'll talk about steroid first. They're made from lipids, which are made from cholesterol in the adrenal glands. And these are little caps situated above each kidney. We also have them in the reproductive glands. Steroids are really amazing chemicals because they can flow across lipid membranes of cells. So they're not stopped by the cell membrane, and they're not even stopped by the nuclear envelope. They'll pass right through and directly influence the DNA. In this way, they can turn like a switch by affecting the genes and DNA. Non-steroid hormones are different. They can't flow into cells, but they can still attach to or bind to targets, receptor sites on the membranes of each cell. Good example of this is insulin I've talked about. It's a non-steroidal hormone. It binds to the surface of red blood cells, and it's the key that unlocks the door so glucose can flow inside. There's various glands. I'm going to talk about the pituitary. It interacts with the hypothalamus to control so much in the body. I mentioned milk production, but other factors as well. Produces oxytocin, allows the uterus to contract during labor, and allows the let down of milk. And this is why after a child is born, sometimes the breasts or the abdomen is rubbed to increase the production of oxytocin so that the placenta is delivered, and it also seems to help with the recovery and stemming of the bleeding. It releases antidiuretic hormone that targets the kidney tubules, and this is when we're trying to conserve water, such as we're in a desert, or maybe all night long we haven't had a sip of water while we're sleeping, so ADH hits the distal tubule, telling the kidneys to conserve water, making the urine very concentrated. Also releases thyroid stimulating hormone, and this activates the thyroid gland. And let's talk about thyroid. It's located right near the cricoid cartilage of your airway. The thyroid is going to release calcitonin. This lowers the calcium levels in the bloodstream. Thyroid hormone is released by the thyroid, which affects overall growth rate and metabolic rate. But you can't make TH unless there's iodine in the diet somehow. So we have iodine deficiency resulting in something called a goiter. And you can see if you see this picture here, the thyroid is swollen. It's attempting to compensate. Okay, what it's doing is there's not enough iodine, and so the thyroid has to expand its size to compensate for the low levels of iodine in the diet. It's pretty easy to treat this one. Vitamin D deficiency is going to inhibit the action of calcitonin, because what's happening is calcium is in the bloodstream, and we need it there for muscle contraction and all sorts of activities of the body. But when there's low levels of calcium in the bloodstream, then bone loss occurs in something called rickets. And here's a sad example of it. Hyperthyroidism is when there's too much thyroid hormone produced by the thyroid. And these people may have, rapid heartbeat, high blood pressure. They tend to be thin, nervous, worriers, but not always. These are some classic symptoms. Hypo, you notice the O there, occurs when there are low levels of thyroid hormone. This may result in excess body weight. These people tend to sleep a lot, they're sluggish, and it's sometimes a reason for obesity. You see, few of us are right in the middle of where we should be. Usually our thyroid is a little too active or underactive, and it influences a lot about how we appear. How can you have a thyroid disorder? Well, you can inherit it from your parents, or sometimes autoimmunity, or just inflammation from a disease can cause a thyroid to change its production. Pituitary releases something called somatotropin, called GH or HGH sometimes. It's a growth hormone that's going to affect every cell of the body, well, nearly every cell. It promotes growth when we're young, and it really influences the synthesis of proteins and the rate at which cells divide. Here we have a pituitary giant. When there's an overproduction of GH when a person's young, we have gigantism. So they're proportionally normal, but they're just huge. And it's all happening at the epiphyseal plates of the long bones. Instead of ossifying or sealing over when they're, say, 17 or 18, the growth continues at these plates. When we don't produce enough GH when we're young, we can have a pituitary dwarf. Again, proportionally normal, but they're excessively short. Maybe genetic or caused by tumor or injury, and it is treatable. People can undergo intravenous GH when they're young and correct this problem. If there's an overproduction of GH in adulthood, which happens sometimes, the genes suddenly turn on when they shouldn't, we have acromegaly. There's an abnormal growth of bone and cartilage and connective tissue. So sometimes they have big hands and feet. The jaw gets large. It looks like a horse. You see these sometimes in bodybuilders that are taking illegal levels of GH in their attempt to get huge, and they pay for it. Summary here. Endocrine glands involve hormones. Hormones often exist in a partnership where there's two or more. We have an opposing interaction with insulin that is required if it unlocks the door so that glucose can flow inside. Glucagon opposes insulin because it's going to keep this from happening. And you might say, well, why would it do that? Well, sometimes we need that system to shut down because our body has other demands putting placed on it. Synergistic is when there are two working together harmoniously. Good example here is the pituitary producing prolactin. So we have the milk, we need to release it. Hypothalamus is stimulated sometimes by the suckling on the breast. Oxytocin released, and now milk is let down. A permissive partnership is where one primes the target and the other one triggers it. We think of estrogen stimulating the endometrium so that progesterone can trigger the thickening of that endometrium for fertilization. Types of hormones, we have steroidal ones they're lipid based, made of cholesterol in the adrenal glands on top of each kidney, and also in the reproductive glands. They can flow through cell membranes and move directly into the DNA and switch genes on and off. That's something that non-steroidal hormones just can't do, such as insulin. Endocrine glands, the pituitary, I said a lot about this one. It works with the hypothalamus, which is a neighboring gland. The oxytocin uterus, there's a contraction of the uterus in response to increased oxytocin production. We have letdown of milk. We also have ADH, which is the antidiuretic hormone, causing the body to concentrate the urine by conserving water. Thyroid, it is involved with calcitonin, and this is the old bone release of calcium from bones, which is a disease called rickets. The goiter is due to an iodine deficiency. Hyperthyroidism is when there's an excess amount of thyroxine or thyroid hormone. And these people have a rapid heartbeat, high blood pressure, tend to be thin, very active. Hypothyroidism is low levels of thyroid hormone, tend to gain weight easily. They have a slow metabolic rate. And these disorders can, often we just inherit them, but they can also be caused by autoimmunity or inflammation. Somatotropin is the technical word for growth hormone. It's going to affect nearly every cell in the body, speeds up protein synthesis and cell division. If we have excess amounts of GH while we're still young, we have gigantism because the epiphyseal plates just don't seal when they're supposed to. If there's not enough, then we might have pituitary dwarfism. These are often genetic disorders, but sometimes they're caused by other factors, tumors, injury. Acromegaly is when we get the GH at the wrong time in our life. We get it when we're adults and our bones, the epiphyseal plates have already fused. And now what? Well, we get thickening of the hands, the feet, and the jaw gets huge.